The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of red earth and scrub brush that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Claire Daniels gripped the steering wheel of her rented SUV as the vehicle bounced along the unpaved road leading deeper into the Navajo Nation reservation. It was early March 2025, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, turning the rock formations into jagged silhouettes that looked almost threatening in their stark beauty. Claire had driven nearly 6 hours from Flagstaff, her academic credentials and research proposal packed neatly in her laptop bag, her skepticism firmly in place like armor against the unknown. At 34, she'd built her career on debunking folklore, on finding the rational explanations behind humanity's most persistent myths. She'd investigated supposed haunted houses only to find faulty wiring and carbon monoxide leaks, had traced urban legends back to misremembered news stories and cultural anxieties, had written papers that stripped the mystery from mysteries and left only human psychology and environmental factors. The Skinwalker legends were her next target, and she approached them with the same clinical detachment she'd applied to every investigation before. But as the sun began its descent and the shadows deepened, she felt something she rarely experienced, a flutter of genuine unease in her stomach. The reservation's main administrative building appeared like a mirage, a low-slung structure that seemed to blend into the desert itself. Claire parked and walked toward the entrance, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Inside, the air conditioning was a shock after the dry heat, and she blinked as her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. The woman at the front desk looked up with an expression that Claire had seen before in her work, a mixture of wariness and resignation, the look of someone who'd dealt with too many outsiders, coming to gawk at their culture like it was a museum exhibit. Claire introduced herself, explained her research credentials from the University of New Mexico, and asked to speak with the cultural liaison she'd been corresponding with via email. The woman's expression didn't change much, but she picked up a phone and made a brief call in Navajo, the liquid syllables incomprehensible to Claire's ears. Within minutes, a man appeared from a back hallway, tall and lean with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a faded flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. He introduced himself as Daniel Redfeather, his handshake firm, but his eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly transparent. They moved to a small conference room, institutional and impersonal, with a table scarred by years of use and windows that looked out over the desert. Daniel sat across from her, his posture relaxed, but his gaze never wavering. Claire launched into her prepared speech about her research, explaining that she was interested in documenting the Skinwalker legends from an anthropological perspective, that she wanted to understand the cultural context and psychological factors that kept these stories alive across generations. She emphasized her respect for Navajo culture, her intention to present her findings academically rather than sensationalistically, her background in folklore studies, and her previous work debunking supernatural claims. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, and when she finally finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured, with an accent that suggested English wasn't his first language, but one he'd mastered thoroughly. He told her that the Skinwalker topic was sensitive, that many Navajos wouldn't talk about it at all because discussing such things was believed to invite trouble, and that her presence asking questions might cause problems in the community. Claire had expected resistance, had prepared counter-arguments about academic freedom and the importance of preserving cultural knowledge. But something in Daniel's tone gave her pause. He wasn't being obstructive, she realized. He was genuinely concerned, not about offending spirits or supernatural retribution, but about the very real social consequences of stirring up fears and reopening old wounds. Daniel explained that 3 months earlier, a teenager from the reservation had gone missing while hiking in the backcountry. Search parties had found no trace of him, and rumors had started circulating that a skinwalker was responsible. The community was already on edge. Families were keeping their children close, and some of the elders were talking about performing protective ceremonies that hadn't been done in decades. The missing boy's family was devastated, torn between hope and grief, and the last thing they needed was an outsider poking around asking questions that would remind everyone of their worst fears. Claire felt a pang of guilt, something she'd trained herself not to indulge during investigations, but she pushed it aside. Her work was important, she told herself, because understanding why people believed in skinwalkers could help address the real problems, the actual dangers like mental health crises, substance abuse, or even potential criminal activity that might be hidden behind supernatural explanations. She told Daniel as much, framing her research as ultimately beneficial, a way to bring rational understanding to irrational fears. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, a tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd heard this argument before and wasn't impressed by it. He told her bluntly that she reminded him of every other academic who'd come through over the years, convinced they understood Navajo culture better than the Navajos themselves, ready to explain away centuries of experience with neat psychological theories and cultural relativism. His words stung precisely because Claire recognized some truth in them, though she wouldn't admit it out loud. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, the air conditioning humming, the desert sun painting the walls orange through the windows. Finally, Daniel sighed and told her he'd help her, not because he thought her research would accomplish anything useful, but because, if he didn't guide her, she'd probably wander around, asking questions in ways that would cause even more problems. He had conditions, though. She would respect boundaries when people didn't want to talk, she wouldn't photograph anyone without explicit permission, and she would run any published material past him before it went public. Claire agreed, relieved to have a local contact, even if his cooperation came with obvious reluctance. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet the next morning to visit some of the areas where skinwalker encounters had reportedly occurred. As Claire walked back to her vehicle in the fading light, she noticed Daniel watching her from the building's entrance, his silhouette dark against the lit doorway, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just crossed a threshold she didn't fully understand. Claire spent her first night on the reservation in a small motel on the edge of the main settlement, a place that catered mostly to the occasional tourist or visiting family members. The room was clean but sparse, with walls thin enough that she could hear conversations in Navajo from neighboring rooms, the cadence rising and falling like music she couldn't quite decipher. She tried to work on her research notes, organizing her thoughts about the psychological mechanisms behind skinwalker beliefs, but found her concentration wandering. Outside her window, the desert night was profoundly dark in a way that city dweller Claire had forgotten was possible, the kind of darkness that seemed almost physical, pressing against the glass. She'd grown up in suburban Boston, done her graduate work in Albuquerque, and even that had felt remote compared to what she was used to. But this was different, an isolation that felt less like solitude and more like exposure, as if the empty landscape offered no place to hide from whatever might be watching. She told herself she was being irrational, that her unease was just unfamiliarity with the environment combined with the power of suggestion from the skinwalker stories she'd been researching. But knowing the psychological explanation didn't make the feeling go away. Daniel picked her up early the next morning in a battered pickup truck that looked like it had seen decades of hard use. He was quieter than the previous day, responding to her attempts at conversation with brief answers that didn't invite further discussion. They drove for nearly an hour on increasingly rough roads, heading toward an area of badlands where the terrain became more dramatic, all eroded spires and deep washes cut by ancient water flow. Daniel finally broke the silence to explain that this region had a long history of skinwalker stories, dating back generations. He described how the legend worked in Navajo tradition, explaining that skinwalkers were believed to be witches who had violated the most sacred taboos, gaining the ability to transform into animals by wearing their skins. But he also offered what Claire recognized as the rational framework underneath the myth, explaining how these stories serve social functions, reinforcing cultural boundaries, providing explanations for unexplained deaths or disappearances, and creating a vocabulary for discussing evil without naming it directly. Claire found herself surprised by his nuanced understanding, realizing she'd unconsciously stereotyped him as a simple believer when he was actually far more sophisticated in his thinking than she'd given him credit for. They parked and began hiking into the backcountry, following faint trails that Daniel seemed to navigate from memory. The morning was cool, but would get hot quickly once the sun rose higher, and Claire was grateful she'd worn appropriate clothing and brought plenty of water. Daniel led her to a spot where the missing teenager's backpack had been found weeks earlier, marked now only by some disturbed earth where the search parties had trampled the area. He explained the official theory that the boy had gotten disoriented, possibly fallen into one of the many hidden ravines that cut through the landscape, and that his body simply hadn't been recovered yet due to the vastness of the search area. But he also shared what people were saying unofficially, the whispered stories about strange animal tracks found near the backpack, about how the boy's friends said he'd been acting paranoid in the days before he disappeared, talking about seeing something watching him from the rocks. Claire took notes, her anthropologist brain cataloguing these details as classic elements of folklore formation, the way communities processed trauma by weaving it into existing mythological frameworks. She asked Daniel if he believed any of the supernatural explanations, and he gave her a look that was hard to read before responding that belief wasn't really the right word for what he felt. Daniel explained that he'd grown up hearing Skinwalker stories from his grandmother, had been taught the traditional warnings and protections, but had also gotten a degree in psychology from Arizona State and worked for years as a counselor on the reservation. He'd seen how these beliefs manifested in people's lives, sometimes harmfully when they prevented people from seeking proper medical or mental health treatment, sometimes beneficially when they provided a framework for processing experiences that Western psychology struggled to address. He told Claire about a case he'd worked on, a teenage girl who'd developed severe anxiety and paranoia, convinced a skinwalker was stalking her. The standard psychiatric approach would have been medication and cognitive behavioral therapy to address what would be diagnosed as a psychotic episode or severe anxiety disorder. But Daniel had worked with a traditional healer who performed a ceremony that acknowledged the girl's fears within a cultural context, and combined with conventional therapy, it had helped her recover. He asked Claire if that meant the skinwalker was real, or if it meant the belief itself had power regardless of objective reality. Claire didn't have a good answer, which bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Her entire career was built on distinguishing between belief and reality, on showing that subjective experience, however powerful, didn't equal objective truth. They continued hiking, and Daniel showed her several other locations associated with skinwalker encounters, each one tied to a story he'd heard over the years. A cave where someone claimed to have seen a figure wearing a coyote skin performing a ritual. A stretch of road where multiple drivers reported seeing an animal that ran impossibly fast alongside their vehicles. A cluster of abandoned hogans where families had fled after experiencing what they interpreted as supernatural harassment. In every case, Daniel provided both the supernatural narrative and potential rational explanations. The cave ritual could have been someone engaged in drug use or mental illness. The animal sightings might have been misidentified wildlife or optical illusions caused by headlights and darkness. The abandoned hogans likely resulted from economic factors and family disputes that got reframed through a supernatural lens. But Claire noticed something that made her uncomfortable. Daniel's rational explanations were thorough and plausible, but he delivered them with a certain detachment, as if he was reciting possibilities he'd thought through but wasn't entirely convinced by. When she pressed him on this, he stopped walking and turned to face her fully. He told her that he'd seen things over the years he couldn't explain, experiences that didn't fit neatly into either the supernatural or the rational categories she was so eager to establish. He wasn't asking her to believe in magic, but he was suggesting that her framework for understanding reality might be too narrow to encompass all of human experience. The conversation left Claire frustrated in a way that surprised her with its intensity. She prided herself on being open-minded within the bounds of evidence and reason, but Daniel was suggesting something that felt like intellectual surrender, an acceptance of ambiguity that her academic training had taught her to resist. They hiked back to the truck mostly in silence, the heat now oppressive, the landscape shimmering with mirages that made distant rocks appear to float above the ground. As they drove back toward the main settlement, Claire's phone buzzed with a text from the motel manager saying that someone had been asking about her, wanting to know why she was on the reservation and what she was researching. The message made her uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Tourism on the reservation was limited but not unusual, and her presence as a researcher shouldn't have been particularly noteworthy. But something about the idea of being watched, of her activities being monitored and discussed, triggered a paranoia she recognized as disproportionate even as she felt it. Daniel noticed her reaction and asked what was wrong. When she explained, his expression grew serious. He told her that not everyone on the reservation appreciated outsiders coming in to study their culture, that some people viewed it as exploitation or disrespect, and that she should be careful about where she went and who she talked to. The warning felt both protective and ominous, and Claire realized with uncomfortable clarity that she was operating in an environment where she understood far less than she'd assumed. Over the next week, Claire conducted interviews with various members of the reservation community, always with Daniel present to provide context and mediate when her questions touched on sensitive topics. She spoke with elders who shared Skinwalker stories from their youth, always with the caveat that talking about such things was dangerous, but that preserving knowledge for future generations was important. She interviewed younger people who expressed skepticism about the old beliefs, but admitted to feeling uneasy in certain places or at certain times. She talked to teachers, healthcare workers, and law enforcement officers about how Skinwalker beliefs manifested in contemporary reservation life, how they complicated everything from medical treatment to criminal investigations. The picture that emerged was far more complex than Claire had anticipated. These weren't simple superstitions held by unsophisticated people, but rather a layered cultural framework that served multiple functions, explaining the unexplainable, enforcing social norms, processing trauma, maintaining cultural identity in the face of ongoing colonization, and providing a language for discussing very real dangers like domestic violence, substance abuse, and mental illness that might otherwise go unaddressed. Claire found herself particularly drawn to the story of the missing teenager Jacob Begay, whose disappearance had triggered the current wave of Skinwalker anxiety. She managed to arrange a meeting with his mother, Sarah, a woman in her early 40s who looked a decade older, worn down by grief and uncertainty. They met at Sarah's home, a modest house on the edge of the settlement with a small garden out front that was struggling in the arid soil. Sarah spoke haltingly about her son, describing him as a good kid who'd been doing well in school, had plans to attend college, had never given her serious trouble. But she also shared details that Claire's journalistic instincts recognized as significant. Jacob had been acting strangely in the weeks before he disappeared, withdrawing from friends, spending long hours alone, sometimes coming home late with no explanation of where he'd been. He'd started having trouble sleeping, told his mother he felt like someone was watching him, had once mentioned seeing someone or something near their house at night that vanished when he tried to get a closer look. Sarah had assumed it was teenage stress, maybe girlfriend problems or academic pressure, and hadn't pushed him to explain further. Now she tortured herself with what-ifs, wondering if she'd missed signs of something more serious. The rational explanation seemed obvious to Claire. Jacob had been experiencing mental health issues, possibly the onset of a psychotic disorder or severe anxiety, and in his confused state had wandered into the desert and succumbed to exposure or accident. The Skinwalker narrative was the community's way of making sense of a senseless tragedy, of finding meaning in random misfortune. But when Claire gently suggested this interpretation to Sarah, the woman's reaction was sharp and defensive. She insisted that her son hadn't been crazy, that something had been targeting him, that the strange occurrences weren't delusions, but real events that multiple family members had witnessed. She described finding animal tracks outside Jacob's window that didn't match any local wildlife, hearing strange vocalizations at night that sounded almost but not quite human, noticing that their dogs refused to go near certain areas of their property where they'd previously roamed freely. Claire's skeptical mind catalogued these as classic elements of suggestion and pattern-seeking behavior, the way humans find significance in random data when they're looking for it. But Sarah's conviction was so total, her grief so raw, that Claire found herself unable to dismiss her experiences as simply misperception or superstition. The reality was that Jacob was gone, and whether skinwalkers existed or not, something had happened to him. Daniel had been quiet during the interview, but as they left Sarah's house, he pulled Claire aside and told her they needed to talk seriously. They drove to a quiet spot overlooking the valley, parked, and Daniel turned to face her with an expression more troubled than she'd seen before. He explained that there were things he hadn't told her, details he'd been holding back, because he didn't think she was ready to hear them without immediately dismissing them as superstitious nonsense. But given her persistent questioning and her insistence on digging deeper into Jacob's disappearance, he felt obligated to share the full picture. 3 days before Jacob vanished, Daniel had received a call from the boy's school counselor reporting that Jacob had come to her office in a state of extreme agitation, claiming that a man had been following him, watching him from a distance, always staying just out of clear sight. The counselor had taken it seriously enough to review security footage from the school, but had found nothing unusual. She'd recommended Jacob see a mental health professional, but before an appointment could be arranged, he was gone. Daniel had looked into it informally, asking around, and had learned that 2 other teenagers in the past year had reported similar experiences of being followed or watched, both shortly before experiencing what were officially classified as mental health crises, but what the community whispered might be skinwalker encounters. Claire's analytical mind immediately began constructing explanations. Perhaps there was a predator operating on the reservation, someone using the Skinwalker legends as cover for criminal activity, stalking vulnerable teenagers and either harming them directly or terrorizing them into mental breakdown. It wouldn't be the first time cultural beliefs had been exploited by someone with malicious intent, and it would explain the pattern Daniel was describing without requiring any supernatural elements. She shared this theory with Daniel, expecting him to be relieved by the rational framework, but his response surprised her. He told her that possibility had already been investigated by tribal police in coordination with the FBI, given the federal jurisdiction issues on reservation land. They'd found no evidence of a human predator, no additional victims, no pattern that suggested serial crime. The teenagers who'd experienced crises had recovered and couldn't provide any useful descriptions of their alleged stalker. Security footage, when available, showed nothing unusual. The cases remained officially unsolved, attributed to the various stresses of adolescence on the reservation, but the lack of physical evidence didn't make the experiences any less real to those who'd lived through them. Daniel asked Claire what her theory was, when the rational explanation led nowhere, when all the evidence suggested psychological phenomena, but the affected individuals insisted on physical reality. That night, Claire lay awake in her motel room, her mind racing through everything she'd learned, trying to organize it into a coherent framework that preserved her rationalist worldview while accounting for the genuine distress and conviction she'd witnessed. She thought about mass hysteria, about how communities could experience collective delusions when under stress. She thought about confirmation bias, about how once people believed in skinwalkers, they would interpret ambiguous stimuli through that lens. She thought about the power of cultural narrative, about how stories shaped perception and memory. But she also thought about Sarah Begay's grief, about Daniel's troubled conviction, about the missing teenager who remained missing regardless of anyone's beliefs about why. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions. You're making things worse. Leave before you become the next story people tell." Claire's heart hammered in her chest, the message feeling simultaneously like validation of her investigation's importance and a genuine threat she couldn't dismiss. She screenshot the text and forwarded it to Daniel with a message asking if this was the kind of resistance he'd warned her about. His response came quickly. "Don't ignore this. People are watching you. Some because they're afraid of what you'll uncover. Some because they're afraid of what you'll wake up. Both kinds of fear are dangerous." Claire stared at the message, unable to tell if Daniel was warning her about human opposition or suggesting something more ambiguous. And for the first time since arriving on the reservation, she felt genuinely afraid. The threatening text message catalyzed something in Claire, transforming her academic curiosity into a more personal mission. She told herself it was about journalistic integrity, about not being intimidated into abandoning legitimate research. But truthfully, it was also about pride and stubbornness, about refusing to be chased away by anonymous threats. She pushed Daniel to introduce her to more people, to take her to more remote locations, to share the stories that people usually kept to themselves. Daniel complied with obvious reluctance, warning her repeatedly that she was crossing lines that would be difficult to uncross, that some knowledge came with obligations she might not be prepared to fulfill. They visited a traditional healer, an elderly woman named Margaret, who lived in a remote hogan and spoke primarily Navajo, with Daniel translating. Margaret was suspicious of Claire's intentions, but eventually agreed to discuss the skinwalker phenomenon in general terms. She explained the traditional Navajo view that certain individuals, usually motivated by jealousy or desire for power, could perform rituals that corrupted their spirits and granted them abilities ordinary people didn't possess. But she also described these not as supernatural powers, but as psychological states, ways of being that allowed someone to operate outside normal social constraints, to harm others without the inhibitions of conscience or community responsibility. Claire found this interpretation fascinating because it blurred the lines between the psychological and the supernatural in ways her academic framework struggled to accommodate. Was Margaret describing actual shape-shifting, or was she describing sociopathic behavior through the lens of cultural metaphor? When Claire pressed for clarification, Margaret became irritated, saying through Daniel's translation that the white woman's insistence on categorizing everything as either literally true or metaphorically true missed the point entirely. Some things were true in ways that transcended those categories, true in their effects and their meaning, even if they couldn't be captured by rationalist epistemology. The conversation left Claire frustrated, but also intellectually stimulated in a way she hadn't felt since graduate school, when ideas still felt new and challenging rather than safely categorized. As they left Margaret's hogan, Daniel mentioned almost casually that the healer had warned him privately that Claire was attracting attention from forces that didn't appreciate scrutiny, whether those forces were human or something else. Claire asked him directly if he believed in literal skinwalkers, shapeshifters and witches with supernatural powers, and Daniel's answer was maddeningly ambiguous. He believed in evil. He believed some people were capable of things that seemed impossible, and he believed that Western rationalism's insistence on material explanations sometimes prevented people from protecting themselves from very real dangers. That evening, Claire decided to drive out to one of the remote areas Daniel had shown her, a place where multiple Skinwalker sightings had been reported over the years. She went alone, despite Daniel's protests, telling herself she needed to experience the location without his mediation to form her own unfiltered impressions. The drive took her deep into the backcountry as the sun was setting, the landscape turning surreal in the fading light. She parked near an old abandoned structure, possibly a former trading post, and began walking the perimeter with her phone camera ready to document anything unusual. The silence was profound, broken only by occasional wind and the distant cry of what might have been a coyote or some other predator. Claire felt her rationalist confidence beginning to waver as darkness fell more completely than she'd anticipated, her phone's flashlight creating a small bubble of visibility that somehow made the surrounding darkness feel even more oppressive. She told herself repeatedly that fear was just evolutionary programming, that her nervous system was responding to environmental cues of potential danger in ways that had once been adaptive, but were now unnecessary in a world where real threats came from cars and disease, not predators in the night. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold, a vocalization that was almost but not quite human, somewhere between a laugh and a howl, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond her flashlight's reach. Her rational mind immediately began cataloging possibilities: coyote, owl, wind through rock formations creating acoustic anomalies. But her body responded with pure primal terror, adrenaline flooding her system, every instinct screaming at her to run. She backed toward her vehicle, keeping her light moving in sweeps that revealed nothing but empty landscape and dancing shadows. The sound came again. Closer now, or maybe just seeming closer because her fear was amplifying everything. Claire reached her SUV and scrambled inside, locking the doors with hands that shook embarrassingly. She started the engine and drove away faster than was safe on the rough road, her headlights bouncing wildly, her heart hammering. It wasn't until she was halfway back to the main settlement that her breathing returned to normal, that she could think clearly enough to analyze what had happened. She'd experienced a moment of irrational fear triggered by unfamiliar sounds in an unfamiliar environment, nothing more. The mind was powerful, suggestion was powerful, and she'd scared herself by deliberately placing herself in a situation designed to evoke fear. It was textbook psychology, exactly the kind of thing she'd written papers about. But when she got back to her motel and checked the photos she'd taken on her phone, there was something in one of the images that made her stop. In a shot of the abandoned building, taken just before she'd heard the sound, there was a shape in the background, dark and indistinct, but definitely present, roughly human-sized, but positioned in a way that seemed wrong, too angular, too still. She zoomed in, enhanced the image as much as her phone would allow, and the shape remained ambiguous, possibly a trick of shadows and low light, possibly something that had been there. She sent the image to Daniel with a message explaining what had happened, and his response came quickly. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You went looking for something, and now it knows you're looking. Come to my house tomorrow morning. There's someone you need to meet." Claire tried to call him for clarification, but he didn't answer. She spent the night sleepless, alternating between rational analysis of the photo, likely a shadow or misinterpreted object, and irrational dread about what Daniel's cryptic message might mean. By dawn, she'd convinced herself multiple times that she was being ridiculous, that fear and suggestion were making her see patterns in randomness, but the conviction never quite took hold. Daniel's house was modest, located on the outskirts of the main settlement, with a clear view of the surrounding landscape. When Claire arrived, there was another vehicle already parked outside, a tribal police cruiser that made her nervous for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Inside, Daniel introduced her to Officer Thomas Blackhorse, a middle-aged man with the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen too much and learned to keep his reactions controlled. Thomas explained that he was the primary investigator on Jacob Begay's disappearance and several other cases involving missing persons or unexplained incidents on the reservation. He'd been following Claire's investigation with interest, partly because he was concerned about her safety and partly because he was hoping she might uncover something his official inquiries had missed. They sat around Daniel's kitchen table, drinking coffee that was too strong, and Thomas laid out what he knew. Over the past 5 years, there had been 11 incidents on the reservation that officially remained unsolved. 3 missing persons, 5 cases of severe psychological breakdown requiring hospitalization, and 3 deaths that were officially classified as accidents but which had elements that bothered him. In every case, the individuals involved had reported being followed or watched in the days before the incident, often describing their stalker in terms that were maddeningly vague and contradictory. Thomas showed Claire his case files, explaining that he'd compiled them unofficially because his official reports had to stick to evidence and facts, but his instincts told him there was a pattern the official process was missing. He'd mapped the locations of the incidents and found they clustered around certain geographic areas, places that also happened to have long histories of Skinwalker stories. He'd interviewed dozens of people and heard consistent descriptions of feeling watched, of seeing figures that seemed wrong somehow, of experiencing psychological pressure that built over days or weeks until something snapped. From a law enforcement perspective, he suspected there might be a predator or predators using the Skinwalker legends as psychological warfare, terrorizing victims before either killing them or driving them to self-destructive behavior. But after 5 years of investigation, he had no suspects, no physical evidence, no witnesses who could provide useful information. Whatever was happening operated in a space between the provable and the believed, leaving only damaged people and unanswered questions. He told Claire bluntly that her investigation was stirring things up, making people nervous, and potentially putting herself in danger from whatever forces were at work, whether human or otherwise. He showed her the threatening message she'd received, which he'd traced to a burner phone that had been destroyed after sending it, and told her that whoever sent it had the sophistication to cover their tracks in ways that suggested either technical expertise or institutional resources. Claire felt the investigation closing around her like a trap, each new piece of information raising more questions than it answered, each potential explanation leading to dead ends or contradictions. She asked Thomas directly if he believed in skinwalkers, and his answer was careful. He believed in evil. He believed some people were capable of extraordinary cruelty, and he believed that whether the mechanism was supernatural or psychological didn't matter as much as the reality of the suffering it caused. Daniel added that perhaps the question of literal truth was less important than the question of what they were going to do about the pattern they'd all recognized. Claire realized with uncomfortable clarity that she'd come to the reservation expecting to debunk a myth, and was instead discovering something far more complicated, a situation where supernatural beliefs, psychological trauma, cultural conflict, and possibly criminal activity were so intertwined that separating them might be impossible. She thought about her academic career, about the papers she'd planned to write, about the clear conclusions she'd expected to draw, and understood that none of that was going to happen. The truth here, whatever it was, resisted the kind of neat categorization her discipline demanded. That night, Claire made a decision. She would finish documenting what she'd learned, compile her interviews and observations, but she would not publish academic papers or give conference presentations about the Skinwalker phenomenon. The community's stories were not hers to dissect and explain to outsiders, and her investigation had already caused enough disturbance without adding public exposure to the mix. She discussed this with Daniel, who seemed relieved, but also warned her that deciding to leave didn't mean she could forget what she'd learned or escape whatever attention she'd attracted. The investigation had changed her in ways she was still processing, had shaken her certainty about the boundaries between the rational and the irrational, had forced her to confront the limits of her own understanding. As she prepared to leave the reservation, packing her notes and equipment, she received one final message from the unknown number. Wise choice. Some things are better left alone, but you've seen too much to ever really leave. It stays with you now, watching from the edges of what you think you know. Claire deleted the message, but knew she'd remember it, knew that every unexplained shadow, every strange sound, every moment of irrational dread would carry echoes of her time on the reservation. She drove away as the sun set over the Arizona desert, the landscape beautiful and terrible in its vastness, and wondered if the Skinwalker legends were true in any literal sense, or if they were simply the name people gave to the darkness that lived in human nature, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. Either way, she understood now that some questions didn't have answers, only deeper questions, and that the line between the real and the unreal was far more permeable than her academic training had prepared her to accept.